for tonight's event, as well as on our members only area for NZATD. So just wanted to firstly welcome you all. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to come and join us at tonight's session. I'm really excited about hearing Miranda speak about scenarios, turning scenarios into interactive stories. We've certainly had, a lot of response through sending out saying we've got this event coming. We've had really good response, which was fantastic. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Miranda. Firstly, please feel free.
Yeah, ik stop.
Is that better sound-wise? Please feel free to use the chat facility to write any comments as we go along, and I think that's about it, actually. It's mainly the chat. So I will hand over to Miranda to talk about turning scenarios into interactive stories. Thanks, Miranda.
Thank you, Helen, for introducing me. I can hear something on the background. Okay. Oh, hi, Nicola. Great to see that there's people from Australia here. And I think there's people from a bit farther away as well. So it's great to see. So yeah, for those who don't know me, as I'm Miranda, and I'm a senior learning designer since a very long time, and I also do a PhD at Auckland University of Technology. Mainly I'm saying that because it's a big part of what I'm going to present today. I wouldn't know all these things if I did not do the research. So basically, I do learning design and serious game design. Here are a few examples of things that I made over the past years. They're all scenario-based, story-based, e-learning, and so I specialize in narrative design and do the PhD about it. So I love to write good stories, and instructional designers, as we all know, need to write a lot. Now, my luck is that I have liked writing from being a child. I worked as a copywriter, I worked as a journalist, and I read a lot, like really a lot. I love reading. So I learn from books, from movies, about writing dialogue, structures. But what we are missing there is we need to write interactive things for our scenarios. And that's how I kind of rolled through interest into the PhD research of turning to games to learn from people who can make really good interactive writing. So interactive fiction, some of you might recognize these screenshots, some of you might not. It depends a little bit on your age. This is where it kind of all began for me. These were the first games that I played back in the 80s, and they were very, very text-based. So just no graphics, very limited graphics, whole worlds were described, journeys were mapped, you had encounters with characters, dialogues. And so I'm kind of looking at that start of writing in games. But does that mean that I only look at the old stuff to get inspired? Definitely not. So I have here a whole number of games, because quite often when you talk to people about using games, they all think about Fortnite, Candy Crush, and think like, how can you learn about stories from these games? Now, there's a whole lot of games that actually really focus on the written word. And the narrative designers of those games, they're constantly evolving and perfecting and experimenting with their craft. So just a quick heads up to get you all to do something as well. Has anyone played any of the games on this screen? I'm going to give you a few minutes. Just type it in the chat. Which one have you played? Okay, someone's played 80 Days. That's really good because that's a really important one that I love to use. Okay. So that's Yes, you feel like you're missing out, you do. So all these games, while they do have graphics, they completely concentrate on writing choices. They're very text-based as well, and they're very popular high-level games. So for example, 80 Days was in 2016 the Apple Game of the Year. Fallen London is incredibly popular. So all these games inspire me to write better scenarios. So how do I learn from these games? I look at blogs, at industry event talks, at interviews, and I've got a few of the people that I admire greatly in that world. Jean Leggett, Emily Short, John Ingold, Alexander Swords. Probably people you've never heard of, but that are like my big heroes, and some of them are my friends in the meantime as well, I'm happy to say. And so these people write about how they make interactive choices. And so there was a bit of a background of why I'm doing this and how, but let's now look at why you're all here for. How are we going to use those narrative design techniques from games to make really good story-based learning? So we're going to look at, I'm just going to put my timer here next to me. We're going to look at 4 big things. We're going to look at how you make your learning outcomes into stories. So how do we design them? Where do we even start before we write? How do you design your characters? How do you look at choice design based on what games do? And that's like the meat of the presentation, that's the big one. And how branching structures work. So since you're all here for scenarios, you will know about branching. So let's start with the first one. So we all use learning objectives, outcomes, aims, whatever you want to call them, or even another term, to start our learning. That's the base of our learning. So how do we go from outcomes to stories? So what we are doing is basically we're going to create a world with those outcomes. So building a world is something that we know from games and books, you know, mostly fantasy and science fiction. Writers and game writers make a whole world with a geography and a culture and myths and politics. And but obviously, when we make scenarios for our learning, we're talking about a tiny micro world. So I've put it there on the screen. So we're going to develop an imaginary setting with coherent qualities. That comes from the source of all truth, Wikipedia, but I really liked it. And what we're doing is we're creating that world to become immersed in it and to start thinking in that world. And in our case, we really focus on a very small part of a world. And I've just put like a doctor's office in there. So, for example, if we make learning for doctors to learn how to do things or how to talk to patients, that world is going to be that small office with the patients that come in there. And so we want to make a tiny world that is to be believable, coherent for the learner, and authentic. And so to build that world, we're going to start with our own unique guide as learning designers. We're going to have learning outcomes. So I've got an example here of a course that I made about effective stop smoking conversations with pregnant women. So the course was for midwives and other healthcare providers to have conversations with women about stopping smoking when they're pregnant, but they were focused on difficult conversations. So women who've got a lot of things going on in their lives, and stopping smoking is actually the last thing that's on their mind and that's worrying them in their lives. So what we see here is the outcomes we focus on. So what do we want the midwives to do? So that's where we are going to start, and we're going to attach those outcomes to the different characters in our micro world, the different situations and locations in our micro world, because we want to create believable settings. So here Excel came to my rescue. So what we did with the subject matter experts was we just outlined all the people that would exist in those midwives' worlds. What ethnicities of women, which age groups, stage of the pregnancy they were in, is it the first, second, or next visit of the midwife? What's their family situation? Do they have medical backgrounds? Which other issues are going on at home? Are there any problems with the kids? So a lot of, and then also the background of the smoking. So all the things that actually defined the different patients that the midwives could have. And we put all those characteristics together to start building our world and the people that walked around in it. So that's where we used the, where we worked with the subject matter experts to make sure that that world was going to be full and authentic. So once we had all these, you have all these attributes, you're going to link them to different outcomes. So you're going to hustle them all together. What I did was basically I wrote everything on cards. So everything we've seen in the previous slide, all these bits and pieces, you write those on cards and you start piecing those together. So you say, and then you get your overview story when you put those together. So here, that's one of the micro worlds that the learner is going to enter. It's the world of Rigi, who's 28 weeks pregnant. She's Maori, and she's got all this background. She's got a 3-year-old, and the dad of the father of the baby smokes, and so on. She's got, so that's your little mini world that you create for the learner to step into. This is what's going to happen and where they need to make choices. So the location is the home living room of this person, and that's where the scenario is going to happen. So here's Rigi. By the way, this was a video-based course. So here's Rigi with her little daughter. And we have those videos where you have to make choices. So that's how I build up my world in each situation that's going to happen in the scenario by linking the outcomes to all the attributes of things that might happen, people's character traits, facts, surroundings. So you really build that like someone would build a world in a book or a game. Like, look at all the details. And even if all the details don't really come up in the scenarios, you must remember that even having them in your head is going to make you write much better, because you know these people, you know these situations, and they are real and full. So just the last thing, just how does that link to games? So in games, all these things are linked to the goals for the player as well. So you look at the goals, you build those worlds of all the bits and pieces that you're going to encounter, and everything fits together. It's really looking at all the details, getting them together. So the next thing we're going to look at is, how do you design your characters? Now, games look at a number of different things. They look at the traits, the facts, and the relationships. And what we do as learning designers in our character design is often we focus too much on the facts. For example, if we look again at the woman I was talking about, Rigi. So we often look at ages, backstories, the ethnicities. So she's in her late 20s, she's got a 3-year-old, her current partner smokes heavily. So these are all facts and backstories, and they will help me, but they are not going to help me really write a believable character that's going to answer me, that's going to talk to me. Because these are components that will influence it, but there's something much more important that you need to determine, and what games do, is that you actually need to focus on rather who this person is than what they are. So when you look at traits, they set us up to write more believable and coherent stories and dialogues. So if you look at these three characters, this is a screenshot from a visual novel game that I made for NetSafe here in New Zealand on bystander behavior in cyberbullying situations. So you've got Latifa at the right, she's a generous and kind person. Jihun in the middle, he's a resourceful but quiet boy. And Bin is devoted but easily swayed. And these are character traits, and they make it actually easier for you to write dialogue because of those character traits. You kind of know these people as a writer, and you know how they might react and why they react that way. So that's really important, that your characters not only have that background story, but you kind of know who they are. Are they someone who's gonna lash out easily and say something angrily? Are they someone who's really shy and not dare to say anything? And a bit further in my presentation, we'll see how that influences the way you write your dialogue and your backstories. So let's have a look at the most important part of the interactiveness of our stories. And those are the choices. And we all know when we write branched scenarios, writing the choices is the meat of it all, making sure they're not too obvious, making sure they align to your learning goals, just making them interesting and meaningful for people. So we have now built a micro world with locations, situations, and characters. And actually, I could entertain you for 3 sessions at least on choices. So I'm going to stick to some really main insights for your next bits of writing. And we're going to work with examples. Now, many of you I have seen, and thank you so much for going through that pre-exercise. Because it's going to be really important now that you saw what I tried to do here. Now, a little disclaimer, because I saw some people made a comment on the stereotypes in my example. That was quite deliberate to kind of let you go easily through them without having to think too much. So some of the people in the story were, I know, real stereotypes and tropes, but there was a bit of a deliberate thing there. And so what you're going to see now is the different versions that I gave you in that exercise. We're going to see why I gave them and how the different ways of writing actually influence how you feel about your choices and how you need to keep that in mind when you make your scenarios.
Miranda, before you jump into that, there's just been a question that's come up. I was wondering if you could answer it. Joanna asks, do you think coming up with realistic traits and good dialogue design is something most people can learn, or is it a skill only a few people are really good at?
No, it's definitely something you can learn. So let's say that one of the big reasons that I do this research and what I want to come out of it when I'm finished is clear guidelines and help for instructional designers to do this. So for example, for the character building, there's whole lists of traits that you can look at. And I can't stress enough how important it is to work with your subject matter experts, because you're going to look at, for example, with the midwives, at the variety of clients they had, what they tell you about them. You can ask them questions about the different types of people that they encounter, their character traits, the unusual character traits, because I see Tracy asks, is it possible to avoid stereotyping? Yes, definitely. So you're going to have to reduce in a certain way, but it is definitely possible to make richer characters than the ones that I presented in my little exercise. For example, some of the women in the midwife course were quite complex, had a lot of things going on, wanted to, for example, do their duty towards their elders, but on the other side were not really convinced they should stop smoking for other reasons, and there were financial reasons. They had lots of things going on and quite complex decisions to make. So working with your subject matter experts, I think, is your main inducement to, your main background to get the realistic traits. And writing good dialogue design, that's going to come in the next bit. So how can you write those choices? What are models that can help you? There was an elaborate answer, but there's some things that are going to come back. So what some writers in academia call choice poetics is balancing three elements in your choice, and you saw that in the exercise. So you've got the framing of your choice, the options, and the outcomes. So the framing of your choice is, what does the player of the learner know about the situation, about what's been happening before? If you've got a scenario in different steps, what are the characters' facts and traits? Have you managed to find those out? And what do you think the possible outcomes of your choices might be? So it's that whole framing of the choices that are before you in your mind. And what we're now going to do is look at how you write that framing and how you can make it different. So as an example that I've used, that we're going to use throughout the rest of the presentation, is a physio appointment. So you as the learner, imagine you're making, so you make, as a learning designer, you're making a course for physiotherapists on how to work with their clients and how to talk to them and how to, convince them to do their exercises and so on. So I'm going to take the same small example each time, and we're going to change it. So in the situation, your next client is Diane, who's been struggling with back pain for months. How are you going with those daily exercises we introduced last week, you ask? Great, she says. Then we got choices. Now, as in, we don't know very much here. Like, has she done the exercises? Has she not done the exercises? As a learner, I need a bit more to go on. And the important thing to think about with a conversation is that when you're live, when you're in reality, there's a lot more happening. There's the body language, there's underlying emotions, and we must also consider the fact that conversations are not just a simple back and forth. There's a lot going on if you deconstruct conversations. We might hide emotions, withhold information, dance around what we really mean, avoid certain topics, emphasize others. And so it's going to be a real challenge for us to write those, especially if you don't have, the money to make videos. And even videos cannot always portray everything. So what can we do? We can write a bit more. So what I've done here is I've actually added a little bit of body language in my description. So I've added a paragraph. So I've always put like a red box around it so you can see the difference with the previous one. So you see Dion hesitate briefly before she answers, and that says enough. She's probably not been doing them, and you sigh. So that's better, but in a sense, that's too much. So that's something that I often see in scenarios how they're written by many learning designers, is we're trying to make everything clear. We're talking, we're exposing everything. Now, that detracts from the authenticity. And that's where a lot of the game writers that I've been talking about work with something called subtext. We as humans, we often read a lot between the lines. When we see someone's body language, we have our thoughts about it. We might be right, we might be wrong. But we need to make sure that we use that subtext also in our learning design, as we got to count on people to look at that authentic situation, think a bit about it. So she smiles, she looks down, then looks at you, she says, yeah, great. So as a physio and as a learner, you need to think a bit more about it. Well, it does look like she's, you know, the body language is like, I haven't been doing my exercise, but I'm afraid to say it. And what I'm showing with this next example here is how you can combine what we talked about before, the character traits, with that subtext. So if you've got another patient who's got different character traits, so Dion's shy and she's afraid to tell you that she hasn't done these exercises. And on the other hand, there's Tom who couldn't care less. And he's, so you ask how you're going with those exercises we introduced last week, and he's like, yeah. So in a different way, he does the same. But so these scenarios become much more interesting and much more realistic because the people are real. And maybe the way you as a physio need to handle the situation is going to be the same, even though the scenario looked different. So that's how we use the subtext. And I think the main message there is try to reduce the exposition, the explaining it all, the setting the scene overly large, by trying to look at what it would be in a real situation and using that subtext. Also, people don't like to read a lot. So make the best use of that subtext. See if there's details that you can throw away that are, you know, not important, that can be derived from other bits. So you really need to look at making it less with using the subtext.
Miranda, Angela says, is developing characters with realistic traits like the process of creating personas for web design?
Yeah, it could be in a sense. Yeah, definitely. So looking at personas in UX is definitely a good exercise to help with this. Yeah.
Okay. And thank you. And Nicholas says, how much balance should be given to culture? So not meeting eye contact, looking down. Could you be respectful, not avoiding some cultures? For example, how much balance do you give to that?
Yeah, so it depends on the course. So whether it is an important part in your learning outcomes. So definitely in the one that I showed before for the midwives, it was really important because we were focusing on Pacifica and Maori clients of the midwives. So we really had to make sure we understood the cultural background of saying certain things, of offering certain things. So one of the very basic ones was coming into the Maori household and they offer you a cup of tea and you actually really don't want that, but it's very impolite to do that. So how are you going to handle this? Noticing things in the background, also with the subtext of elderly family members being present during the conversation. So it depends on the course. Obviously, if it's not important in your outcomes, you might give it less attention than when it's really part of what you're trying to teach your learner. I hope that was an answer to what you were asking. So framing and subtext, we can combine that with the character traits. And let's now look at the next part, the options and the choices. Now there's a lot to say about choices. So where do we even start? It's going to be different for people in their experience is the order of presenting your choices. Do I make them active or descriptive? Which character is saying it? What do I know about them? Which point of view do I use? Do I use a third person, second person? How long are my options? And people, you know, you're all learning designers or involved in learning and development. Multiple choice questions are hard enough as they are. And there's all these things behind them. So there's so many variations. So what's the magic number is also a big question. Some people say 3, others say 4. So anyway, let's look at a few of those. Let's start with active or descriptive. What does that mean? So when you use a descriptive way of writing, you're just going to describe what you are saying or how you're saying it. So here, when you're the physio, it's like you ask if the exercises give Dion any concerns or if they're painful, or you tell her the exercises are important, so just to keep doing them, or you give her extra exercises for the next week. So you basically describe what you're going to do. And it gives the player the option to imagine how they would say it in their own way. So it doesn't really prescribe exactly what they're going to say. And that was a comment that I saw actually in your feedback in the exercise of, like, you know, when it became active, like in the next one that I'm showing, and it becomes dialogue, how it made them feel different. Because it gave them even more, gives you even more context in how you would actually say that and what the reaction of your patient might be in this case. So writing those little dialogues. Now, depending on the course that you're making, it's obviously going to be almost a prescriptive choice, because, for example, if you've got customer service people or sales, there might be certain phrases that you want to teach them to use. So then the active describing is going to be easier, while the descriptive one can be better to avoid alienating some people, because you might be giving them sentences here that they would never say themselves, they would say them differently. And if it doesn't matter which specific phrases they use, it might be easier to go with the descriptive way. And in other cases, it might be better to go on the active ways. So it really is a bit of a balance of who your learner is and what you want to teach them. But it's also important to think about the different emotions these two types of writing choices evoke. And I definitely saw that in your answers, that you might want to go with one of these choices because of the way they are said.
Miranda, there's just a question from Miggy around that magic number. So you're referring to options to choose from, 3 or 4 options to choose from, as opposed to like 3 or 4 scenes?
No, 3 or 4 options to choose from, and that's coming up now. So how many choices? That's a big one. Okay, so how many choices? So obviously a choice needs at least 2. Now 2 is often described as, definitely in games, as the morality choice. Am I going to fight or am I going to flee? Am I going to kill or spare this person? So that's a real duality. It becomes very black and white. So in our learning, we're seldom going to use that. And I'm going to be honest, I kind of hate true false questions, but that's a personal thing, because I don't think they often bring a lot to the table. But definitely in games, that's going to be a very big black and white choice. So 3 is often a preferred one. We see that a lot when people write scenarios, but also a lot in games. Like 3 seems to be really a magic number. 4 is another one that you often see. But more than 4, the learner starts to get confused. There's too much to choose from, and unless you are exploring different actions in a task or steps in a procedure, like you would choose different parts in a game, then I wouldn't go over 4. And definitely in games, the only time you see that is when you, for example, have to choose what your avatar looks like 70 different forms of faces and names to choose from, or what, like in a game like Fallen London, for example, you've got about 20 choices of what kind of person you want to be in the community. Like, I want to be a noble, I want to be a captain, I want to be a bartender. So that kind of choice you can go over 4. But to make a choice on what to do, people get really a bit jittery when it's more than 4. Now, when you choose 3 or 4, obviously we're going to preferably work with some models, because how do you even write those? And that's one of the most important things that people struggle with. Like, I need 3 choices, or I need 4 choices. I can only think of 3. What can I add? Well, games work with models, and these models actually work for us as well. So they are a really good background to talk about with your subject matter expert when you create your authentic possibilities. One of my favorite models for conversations is this accept, reject, deflect option, which is something that John Ingold from 80 Days talks about in one of the sources that I read. And he gives a lot of examples. And when you play games from John Ingold, so 80 Days or Heaven's Fault, and you know this model, you will often really recognize them. So what does this mean for an example in a scenario? So what I've got here is the learner not learning is a telenurse, so a nurse on the phone. And like we have a lot now with COVID, nurses are on the phone and not seeing people live. So there's dad who cries with who calls with a crying baby. Mom's out, she's out with her friends for the first time since birth, and dad's taking care of the baby. Sorry, I'm having a stereotype here again, but it's easy to use those to give the examples. So the telenurse asks the dad, is there anything different about his crying? Does it sound different than normal? Because he's worried. And he says, no, it's not necessarily different crying. It's just he doesn't stop, so he's worried. So what do you say as a telenurse? And you give these 3 options according to the model to your learner. So the first one is accept, which means I just go on with the conversation and I continue on that strain. So you think there's something wrong, but it sounds, so she's just trying to kind of, okay, this is what you're saying, I'm continuing with you in the conversation. The next one is reject, like, yeah, so the crying's the same, but this dad's overly, he's just, being scared for nothing. So he cries as usual. That seems to be fine then. So he must be just missing his mom. So you basically reject and jump to the next thing. And deflect is you don't really reject what he's saying, but you think like, let's go on. So separate from the crying, is there anything else? So you deflect that conversation about the crying being normal or not normal. So that's how you can use that model to think about your answers. And so they're going to give you that nice thing that we want, like not just black and white, but also something gray. So that's a model you can work with, accept, reject, deflect. And another game writer that I use the theories from is she calls it a supportive answer, a challenging answer, or an open-ended answer. So everything goes on. Now, actually in games, they call that last one, the open-ended one, like a bit of a trap door, like I avoid the situation and go on to the next thing. So that's one of the models. for 3 choices. So now if we look at 4 choices, this is one that I really like as well to think about. So you've got 2 gray options here. You've got the yes answer and the no answer, and quite often these are the ones we focus on. They're actually the boring choices, like, yep, it's correct or it's not correct. And so these are the ones we mostly write, but that's mostly not how life works. So the yes, but and the no, and are the really interesting answers. Like, yes, that was correct, but there's more going on, or you need to think about something else. And that can lead, for example, in the next choice. And no, and is like, this was a wrong answer and you've made it even worse by doing this. And you now have an extra problem to solve in your next choice. So these are the ones that are really interesting to write and much more fun for the learner as well. So let's look at an example. So again, the exercises at physio, when you have the yes answer, you just say, is like, so are you feeling all right? Any concerns, any pain? So that's a really good answer. You're probing further. Yes, but is good. It's really good that you're doing them. So you praise them. So it's really, it's a good way of handling things. But then you say, let's continue those for 2 more weeks. So you didn't probe any further. You kind of gave them a bit of encouragement, which was kind of a yesy kind of answer, but there's more. Then you've got the no, where you kind of, put your foot in it, right? You haven't done them probably. Yeah, it's the not correct answer in many of our scenarios. You say something rude or whatever. But a no and is much better, because you say like, no, so you say great work. Now for the next 2 weeks, I want you to add 2 new exercises. So that's a bad answer and you've made it worse, because you've given them even more exercises without probing further into the current ones. So you're making the issue worse, because she's going to have more on her plate and she's probably definitely not going to do her. And if she had any concerns about the previous one, you're just making that happen. So that's how you can think about writing your 4 different options, with 2 gray ones that actually reflect answers that have more to them than just correct, not correct. Now, the last bit of your choice poetics, as I call them, is your outcomes. So you had the framing. What do I know? How do I make my choices? Then writing your choices, and then the outcomes. What happens when I make a choice? Could I anticipate that by the options? Has my choice actually influenced my further options? And that's how we come into the last bit. Now we're talking branching scenarios. So not all branching is the same. So a lot of what you see online when learning design websites or blogs talk about branching scenarios is quite a simple, like, question choices. You go to something, maybe have another choice, but it's very kind of structured. And actually, that's not the interesting way to do it. And that's not how games work. They don't work as linear. So the little image I've got behind that is the just a small part of the branching that I made for that video-based course with the pregnant women. So for those who know the software, that was made in Twine, and I had about 75 different jumps, and the whole thing was 15,000 words before we even started developing. So you see a lot of lines and a lot of spaghetti, and that's how these things could be. But let me show you this. So these are different structures of branching that are used in games, and that you could use in your designs as well. So working So for example, the first one on the top left gives you several bad endings and a whole lot of good endings, because that is something that games do that we in our scenarios seldom do. Is there may be different good outcomes to a scenario-based exercise, and especially if we talk about conversations in, you know, like the examples I gave, patient caregiver conversations, or even, you know, what's another typical e-learning thing, performance reviews or whatever, things where you have conversations. There's actually different ways to skin a cat, different ways to come to good outcomes. And in real conversations, you're also allowed to make a tiny mistake and then correct yourself and still come to a good answer. So that first one is an example of that. And you see there's very complex structures with different clusters as well. You can end up into clusters, or you can have deviations with wrong endings and just one good end. So the second one is actually something that we kind of often use. And what I'll show you in a simplified form is how you can actually work with little bits of story that get unfolded in your choices. So it's something that gets used a lot in games as well, is actually uncovering little pieces of story by making a choice that then lead to other choices. And that's more the structure that you see in that bottom complex one. So by making a choice, there's a whole situation that unfolds. And that's what I mean with having those conversations that can go in different directions but still end up with a good ending. So there might be a way to talk about things that brings you to a certain outcome, and another way to talk about things that brings you to a good outcome. And that's what you see in that left bottom.
Miranda, Liz has asked, do the different branching models have different names?
Yes, they do. I don't know the names, all of them. I think I've got here is like the time cave and the gauntlet and the bottleneck, and there's a whole lot of them. There's actually a really cool article of someone who's made the structures of all these old interactive fiction games and given them all names.
Ja, daar is toch wel even mis mee.
Dear.
Oh, can you
moment.
mute? Yeah.
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 Nee, niet leven.
Yeah.
Oh,
Daar, de klein.
I'm trying to mute it and
Can
they
you
keep
mute?
unmute.
Can you please mute the sound?
You are.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so they do have names. And yeah, so I can share that article if you're really interested in those names. So actually, that was about everything, and there's already been a lot of questions. So I'd be happy to take more. And I'm also very happy for you all to link with me on LinkedIn, ask me any questions later on in by email or on Twitter. And there's also quite a few articles on my website. So thank you so much. I hope that was interesting for you, and I'm open for questions.
Please feel free to unmute yourself to ask Miranda any questions that you might have.
I might ask. Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, Miggy here. I guess I want to ask about the ideal length of a branching scenario. I know it takes a lot of effort and time to really think about the most
17.
authentic choices that we can make people think about. What's the ideal length of a branching scenario? For a video, I know it's like 1 to 9 minutes nowadays because people's attention spans are very short. With branching scenarios, I find that it's easy to get hooked into them because of how much thinking we put into writing, but how long is ideal, generally speaking? Of course, it's case to case.
Okay. No, there's no. I don't think there's an ideal length, but you're right that compared to a video, it's easier to hook people in because they're not just sitting back and listening, right, or watching. No matter how interesting a video is, they have to make choices. But if you're trying to bring certain learning outcomes down, you don't want a branching scenario to last for 20 minutes. So you still want them to be quite short and concise. So we're not making a big game here, even though we're using big game techniques. You want it to be a well-rounded whole that links to certain outcomes, and so you can make different scenarios for people to go to instead of one big one. So what often happens is that if you again look at a medical context, you might say, like, I'm going to talk to patient 1 now, situation unfolds, 5 minutes, you go back, patient 2, there's different things going on. So you want to break it up, chunk it as well, definitely. So, yeah.
Oh ja, dat is zoals in die noepenal te zitten in de stad. Dat moet de markt kunnen zien. Dat is...
Stefan, there's lots of positive comments, Miranda, in the chat. There's a question, are there specific tools you use when creating games? And that's from Ivan.
Specific tools when creating games or creating my scenarios. So when I create my scenarios, I mostly start with something that's not visual. So tools like Twine and Ink, which make text-based stuff. So I use those. So yeah, I had an example of Twine here. So yeah, so I definitely do those first before I start putting them in something that costs more money and effort. So for example, the videos that I made, or something like Storyline or whatever. So yeah, text-based stuff to start with, to do my designs. Yeah, so the other one is Ink, and that's actually the tool from the game developers from Inkle Studio, who made 80 Days and Heaven's Vault and a lot of other games. And it's free to download. And the advantage for me, compared to something like Twine, even though Twine has that nice visual branching, is that this is running text, which makes it easier to edit also for your subject matter experts. And you have the tool that they provide you is you write on one side and you kind of see immediately what it looks like, your choice-based text game on the other side. So that's really nice.
There's a question in here, what are your top 3 books to learn more about branching scenarios? Maybe you'd better provide those after and we'll email those out to everybody.
Yeah, definitely. So one of them that I might mention, because I saw Tracy's comment about short sims. There's actually a book called Short Sims by Clark Aldrich, who shows you how to make really short simulations to achieve learning outcomes. And it's a great book. It's very recent. It's from this year. And it's called Short Sims. It's easy.
Sonia asks, would you recommend the option for people to try out the different branches of scenarios by going back and trying different options?
That's in the end what you want to achieve as well. Like if you write something fun and interesting, people might be enticed to go and see what happens in the other situation, even if they know it's, things are going to explode or whatever. So it's, adding that little bit of humor, or also exploring different ways. So definitely, if you look at a branching like this one, there we go. So the left bottom one there. If you look at those clusters, that so you want people to look at the different ways of arriving at a good outcome, the different ways to do things. So you might send them back, now have a try with this. And what I would just finally like to add with that is that, and that's just a personal opinion, but also a lot of game writers, is that when you look at some blog posts and things in e-learning and talk about branching scenarios, they often say write the correct path first. And that only goes for that top right one. That's if you use that. If you go for others, you're exploring the reality of things, and what can go wrong are also correct paths, actually. They're paths that your learner can use, so they are as important as the correct paths. So I think you should never let that out of your thoughts. Out of your thoughts, that the other paths are as important and need to be as well written for your learning. Yeah.
Miranda says that if you're drawing on a SME for the scenarios, do you sit beside them and write them in Twine, or do you get the SME to write or tell a story which you then take away and polish?
The second one, although for like the midwife course, what we also did was role plays. So the midwives would do a role play with each other. One would play the patient and the other the midwife, and they had a real conversation. I must say they were, we had a lot of fun doing those. But most of the time I take away the stories and ask what people do, what people would say. And then I do write a Twine. It's also easier to write a Twine for people to go through and to make changes for you, because it's rapid. It's easy to check, easy to edit. Yeah.
I noticed Nicola said she's struggling to find the website for Ink. Nicola, we'll send out, along with the 3 most popular books of Miranda, links to Twine as well as Ink, so you can go in and have a look at those.
Yeah, oh, I see that. I've got an extra slide with some some links, but I'll send those through as well. With some of my favorite things to look at. Writing for Interactive Stories and Games from John Ingold. That's, and no pun intended, that's just gold. That talk is amazing. So he changes a scenario on the fly during an hour.
Wow.
In a game, and you learn so much. I think I've watched that video like 10 times. I still keep finding new things. Amazing. Yeah.
Excellent. We're nearly out of time, so just want to thank Miranda so much for a very insightful, detailed, and enthralling presentation. It's fantastic, Miranda. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone for coming along, all the interesting questions. Yeah, and as I said, just feel free to contact me. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm here to learn from you how people react to the different ways of writing, and thank you for everyone who filled in that questionnaire. It's been really interesting for me as well.
Brilliant. Take care, stay safe out there, everyone, and look forward to seeing you at the next NZATD event.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
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 Just a few people still on. Yeah, I think the last 2 there, Miranda, are they your family?
They might be, I think.
I think I think they are. Shall I leave you to catch up with them? I can leave you to catch up with them if you like.
Okay, no, that's good.
All
Give
right.
me a call.
I'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.